Greetings, Mavericks and new viewers. Tonight, direct and live from the Maverick News Network World Studios. This is Maverick News with Rick Walker.
Welcome back to the Maverick News Channel, everyone. Great to have everybody here. I know there's a lot of news out there tonight. The director of the Secret Service testifying today. We have, people wondering what the heck is going on with Joe Biden. But we have a special guest. And so, the rest of the world is covering all of that stuff. And I will try to touch on it at the tail end of the broadcast. But front and center, we have Mike Pekarek back from Ukraine Defense Support tonight to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. And the discussion we are going to have will relate to all of the news of today anyway. So in a roundabout way, we're still going to end up talking about all of today's top news stories through the course of this feature interview, which will commence right after this.
Maverick News. The world is watching.
He's a fighter. He's a survivor. President Trump, defiant, strong. He is determined to make America great again. Pay tribute to the 45th President of the United States with this collectible t-shirt from the Maverick News Memorable Moments collection. Even a would-be assassin's bullet could not stop him. Instead, he emerged with his fist in the air ready to fight for freedom. Get your Trump Fighting for Freedom t-shirt with any donation of $30 or more to Maverick News. There are two iconic artistic designs to choose from, but there is only one way to get these. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Support free speech, free media. Support Maverick News. Call 1-866-248-1490 or order online at supergeeks.tv.
Okay, we're back, and Trump raising his fist in the air, saying fight for freedom, and what that fight for freedom is going to look like, 3 months, 6 months, a year from now, I'm not really sure. Depends on who's in the White House, what that looks like. And here to help us make sense of what's going on is Mike Pekarek again from Ukraine Defense Support. Welcome back, sir.
Thanks for having me again, Rick.
It's our privilege. Really appreciate this. There's so much that has happened since the last time you were here speaking with us. Tonight we're going to touch on, I guess, what constitutes a war crime. We're going to talk about, funding for the war in Ukraine. Just a lot of different things we're just going to explore. But give me, can you... What does all of this mean, do you think, for the war in Ukraine? What's happening politically right now with Biden stepping aside? It looks like maybe Kamala Harris running for the Democrats and J.D. Vance. There's so much going on here. I'm not sure that J.D. Vance is on side with, the effort in Ukraine. A lot of concerns there. Even with Trump, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
I do. I do have to be careful, just right off the bat, that I do represent a tax-free organization. We are apolitical. We advocate and help Ukraine. That is our issue. That is what we do. With that being said, I can talk about some policies that have happened in my knowledge as I was watching. I can tell you that President Biden was sometimes not very good at bragging about all the things that he did, which is unfortunate because he did actually quite a lot. The NATO alliance is stronger because of his leadership and his diplomacy, and honestly, the relationships that he's built over the last many decades with leaders in foreign nations. He did so much to strengthen NATO that it will be difficult to actually understand the historic significance of what he did for a while until we actually see some of the details that probably now are classified because they're still current. And what is happening behind the scenes sometimes still matters on the battlefield. So there's some things that we don't know for a good reason. I will say that President Zelensky gave his heartfelt and very honest thanks. He said, quote, Ukraine is grateful to President Biden for his unwavering support for Ukraine's fight for freedom, which along with strong bipartisan support in the United States has been and continues to be critical. Many strong decisions have been made in recent years, and they will be remembered as bold steps taken by President Biden in response to challenging times. And we respect today his tough but strong decision. I would like to point out that President Biden deciding not to run again is one of the extremely rare politicians, not just in the United States, but in world history. How many people actually step down? It's not common. America is one of the nations that set the precedent for that with George Washington. It even showed up the historical event of Washington stepping aside after 2 terms. Even showed up in that Hamilton musical that hopefully everyone's seen because it's great music. But it's true that when Washington stepped down after 2 terms, historians would say that was when the American Revolution finally ended. Because in 1775, when combat started, we were fighting for our freedom. We were fighting to overthrow a dictator, and parliamentary or congressional representation, all the American Revolutionary themes. But even after the Articles of Confederation, we won the war with the Battle of Yorktown, and then we struggled a little bit, and then we did our Constitution, and then we elected President Washington, and then finally, in 1796, that's when historians consider our revolution over, because Washington could have been a dictator. He could have installed himself as a king. He did not. That is one of the seminal moments in American history, and it's one of the examples that American patriots want to share with the world. We're not dictators. We elect our people. We are free people. And it's important. So Biden stepping down, the details will determine whether anybody could call him another Washington, but that's a pretty high bar. But the fact that he did step down, I recently reread JFK's, it was ghostwritten, but it had JFK's name on it, the Profiles in Courage, where he's talking about the very few American politicians that bucked their party, bucked their own ego and arrogance, and did what was right for the country. And when Biden ran in 2020, he said he would be a one-term president, and he finally was convinced that maybe that's what he should be. I have all the respect in the world for Biden. I served under him in the United States Air Force. And I know people that interacted with him. He was always, as Senator Lindsey Graham said, he's one of the best human beings in American politics. Senator Lindsey Graham said that in an interview in 2015. And Lindsey Graham and Joe Biden served together in the Senate for decades, and then for 8 years while Biden was the vice president. So Lindsey Graham, for all of his faults, knows Biden quite well. I will say that Zelensky did talk with Republican nominee Trump, former President Trump. during the NATO summit or right after. I'd have to look at the date. It was a very frank discussion. But one of the things that we do know about Trump is that Trump likes to feel important. He likes to feel like what he did will be remembered. There's various things that motivate former President Trump and current presidential nominee Trump. The Ukrainian said, let's see, what did he say? He said that dealing with Trump would be hard work, but he also added that Ukrainians are not afraid of hard work, as they've demonstrated the last 10 years and certainly in the last 2.5. So I don't know what I think about J.D. Vance. I do know that he has changed his story quite a bit over the last 10 years. So it's difficult to know what he thinks right now, if that makes sense. Because there's some things that you say out of necessity, and there's some things that you say as a partisan. We used to call them hatchet men. I don't know if that's still the term, where it was their job to go, take a hatchet to the opponent's, arguments and stuff like that. And J.D. Vance has been a hatchet man for the Republican Party for a couple of years. But I do know that he's young. He's relatively inexperienced. And so it's kind of hard to tell where he's at. And that's, I don't know enough about him to be a judge.
Yeah, I'm struggling with him because there's the soundbite going around right now, him saying, and it's an older soundbite of him saying he doesn't really care what happens to Ukraine. There's another one talking about where he's talking about, well, he's comparing the lead up to the war in Iraq to what's going on in Ukraine, saying, have we not learned anything over the past 20 years? But then he was calling Trump the next Hitler at one point too.
Yes.
So now he's his VP pick, and then I'm seeing reports out there of him being attached to Peter Thiel, the billionaire, who was an investor in PayPal early on. He's behind Palantir. He's the big company. He's a billionaire, and there's definitely a connection there. But I'm not even sure where Peter Thiel stands on Ukraine. I'm seeing reports where he's being portrayed as kind of a capitalist boogeyman that is going to steer the Trump administration with his big bucks into supporting Ukraine. And then on the other hand, I see that he's taken contracts. You can argue it both ways, even with Peter Thiel. So I don't know where a Trump administration would end up with
I do know that you're right that it is more complicated than sometimes the stump speeches and all that will make out, because on some levels a campaign speech is just a campaign speech, and how they work is much different. I can say that I served under 4 American presidents. I served under Bush, President 43, the younger Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden. My favorite Secretary of Defense was actually Jim Mattis, who was President Trump's Secretary of Defense. Part of that goes back to my time spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Jim Mattis was one of the commanding generals at the time. And I don't know if you're aware of the famous quote from him. This actually ties into the laws of war, but he famously said early after 9/11, when we were first going into Afghanistan, he said to his soldiers, he said, his Marines, because he was a Marine commander at the time, he said that you need to be courteous, you need to be professional, but you also need to be prepared to kill everyone you meet. And while that has a certain military harshness to it, it's actually very practical advice, meaning that be courteous and professional, you need to do your job. And in terms of the the things, the red meat for Marines and other military people about being prepared to kill everyone you meet. It's one of those, you need to do your job and you need to come home safe. Because if you are not prepared, then Americans and the wrong people will die. American military talks about this a lot, that when we do our jobs properly, people die. And when we make mistakes, the wrong people die. And that's a problem. And Americans are always working to minimize all of that, like the better nations in the world have. So I do know that one of the things that President Trump, when he was president, fought for, he was very loud and, shall we say, crass, for a kind word about it, was talking to the other NATO nations about paying their fair share. NATO had made an agreement that every member state would raise their defense spending to 2% of the gross domestic product. And President Trump was very loud about it, but he was not unique. The other presidents that I served, President Bush and President Obama, also were talking to NATO nations about, hey, look, you guys need to pay more about your military. You need to pay attention. You need to pay the money. Freedom is literally not free. And militaries, especially good militaries, cost a lot of money. And there's just no way around it. So while President Trump was brash and public about it, he was not unique. And I will say one of the things I was going to say about the NATO summit was that let me get my numbers up here. In 2021, so after President Trump left office, only 6 of then 30 NATO nations were above 2%. In 2023, at the end of 2023, so current as of January 1st, 23 NATO nations were above 2%. So in the span of 2 years, we went from 6 to 23, so 17 nations greatly boosted their defense spending. And it was a success because President Biden was asking them the same thing, starting as soon as he took office, because he knew the dynamics from his 8 years serving as Obama's vice president. And one of the things about President Obama was that he was a foreign policy novice. His experience was good. He was a natural leader, but his experience in the foreign realm was almost non-existent. So one of the reasons he chose Biden was because of Biden's very deep, both in terms of knowledge and time, and just personal relationships with foreign leaders. That was President Biden's primary role as Obama's vice president. So President Biden's been working at this for a long time. He had great success leading NATO. I want to give a couple of numbers if I can. So for instance, some people might think the United States is the one that has the highest military budget, but we're actually not. We're certainly in terms of total dollars, but in terms of gross domestic product, the highest is actually Poland, with 3.8% of their GDP going to their defense budget. And it's bigger than that because if you study international economics, $1 in America, or you just travel places, you know well that $1 in America has different value depending on where you go. So the further east you go in Europe, the more a dollar gets you. And this is something that the Economist magazine brought up in, I believe, 1986, if I remember correctly, something called the Big Mac Index, which was a little bit tongue-in-cheek when it started, because what it measured is how much would it cost in various nations to buy a Big Mac. And so in the United States, currently it's about $5.15. It varies regionally because we are kind of a big country. In Canada, for instance, it's $5.25, so very close to the United States. Certainly because America is so big that we've got this range of prices, So the Canadian $5.25 is well within the normal American amount. But in Poland, it's $3.59. So that's what, 75%-ish of what, maybe closer to 80% of the American price. So when I talk about Poland spending 3.8% of their budget on their defense, but every dollar goes that much further in Poland than it does in the United States, that 3.8% looks even more impressive. Second place is the United States at 3.4% last year. It might or might not go up this year. I think the amounts are still in flux. You have some. Greece shocked me at 3.3. The Baltics should surprise no one, between 2.5 and 3. The United Kingdom is at 2.4 and they're going up. Hey, you Canadians, you're at 1.3. So you guys maybe want to look at yeah. Well, and this has a long history. And you guys aren't alone. There's European nations that are in your ballpark. The Cold War, everybody had a bigger defense budget. And when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell, the Americans included, everybody was like, peace dividend. We don't need to spend this giant amount of money on our military, which had secondary effects boosting the economy in terms of computers and like the microchips that we're using to conduct this interview over the net and record it and all that. They were an American invention that was a combination of trying to get better solid state technology into military missiles, specifically the ICBMs, at the time the Sparrow Beyond Visual Range missile and the Sidewinder close-in missile, as well as the Apollo program. And all of those things required something a little bit more stout than a vacuum tube. And so military spending does have serious economic effects. The first internet was the ARPANET, since been renamed to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research, in the United States. But it was ARPANET. It connected a couple of universities with basic data sharing. And you combine that, that was the first IP address system. So military spending has knock-on effects that sometimes are huge. But if you can spend it directly on other things, well, everybody did that. So we get it, but the remaining 9 nations, looking at you, Canada, need to maybe boost your defense spending a little bit more. So I do know Canada is in a bit of a rebuild, so that will help when you guys finish doing that.
Sure.
So
I mean, again, I think that would you I don't know if you can speak to this because of the charitable status of the organization, but is there more stability or predictability with a Democrat back in the White House? Or it seems like it's a little unpredictable if we get Trump in there, both in terms of support for Ukraine and NATO.
So I would agree that we are in flux. There are challenges ahead for everybody. However, it's important to remember that when push comes to shove, when we actually have votes on helping Ukraine, it's extraordinarily bipartisan. The defense bill that passed in April, the supplemental for $61 billion to Ukraine, was almost 80% in favor. And I don't remember if we covered this on the last one, but how many issues in the United States get a vote that is 80% in favor? So the extreme bipartisanship in the United States for helping Ukraine is high. And we've demonstrated that with votes. Various firebrands have raised some bills to halt funding, and those never got more than 20% in favor. So again, 80% bipartisan support to help Ukraine is a little bit baked in. That's been the only, there's been a couple of ups and downs in that, but that's a very, very hard figure for American support for Ukraine. One of the challenges that Ukraine Defense Support is trying to do is let the people that are in office, that are running for office, that will be serving come January when they're sworn in, is the level of support among the voters. Because there's the, when I was at the Ukraine Defense Summit in Washington, D.C., talking to members of Congress in April, that's one of the things that we told. I went into, for instance, a very MAGA Republican, Mike Boss office, Representative Mike Boss, and I was like, look, your voters are in favor. You've got Boeing plants that are helping Ukraine. You've got a General Dynamics ammunition plant and so all of these people in your district are they're helping Ukraine. It's benefiting the local economy because you can't avoid that in defense spending. That's just the way it is. And so it's communicating the very real support and the very real effects, because they talk about, well, why are we spending this much on Ukraine, and are we weakening America? Are we weakening NATO? And those are serious concerns because when you're talking about sending reserve gear like the Bradleys and the Abrams, or President Biden during the NATO summit used his presidential drawdown authority to send yet another Patriot battery to Ukraine, then you have to talk about, well, how do we replace those stocks? And one of the things that we talk about is like, look, a lot of the money that we're spending in the United States on Americans, on high wage, high tech, high skilled jobs that are rebuilding the American military. Because one of the things that President Trump was working on, and President Obama for that matter, everybody after 2014, was like, we're talking about the strategic defense infrastructure. And that's separate from the military. Infrastructure is like, what are your ammunition plants capable of producing every month? And before February 2022, the entire United States was capable of producing less than 30,000 artillery shells a month. And we're talking just dumb artillery shells. They have propellant in the warhead, and that's about it. We're not talking about like the smart Excalibur shells or anything like that. That's since been expanded. We're nearing 60,000, and in 2025, we will be nearing the capacity of 100,000 per month. So we're getting back to Cold War levels. This is of strategic value to the United States, because if you start talking about the threat of China, then we need these. There's fighter production lines we're keeping open for this very reason. Not we're going to get great jets out of them, but the fact that we have a fighter production line open has its own value. One of the reasons we never restarted F-22 production is somebody did a study and said it would cost at least $2 billion just to open up the factory again. And that's before you got even a single jet cutting metal. So the value of a production line is extremely high. So some of the Ukraine defense dollars, we're helping Ukraine, we're expanding our production capacity, but it's also benefiting the United States. It's making us stronger. And that's important to know, because even just not the factory, you're talking about the skilled workers. I can go on, but if you want a historic example,
sure,
going way back. So everybody is aware of the Battle of Midway. Did I mention this on the last podcast?
No.
It's one of my favorite stories. The Battle of Midway is one of the world history's greatest battles. It's one of the most decisive in terms of naval battles. It ranks up there with Trafalgar and Thermopylae. I mean, it's the impact of that win was just, there's just no overstating it. It's one of the most historic, most impactful wins of any battle, certainly a naval battle in world history. The Americans at the time had 3 aircraft carriers fighting that battle. It was the Yorktown class, so it was the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The Yorktown and the Enterprise were laid down. They were ordered by President Roosevelt, FDR, at the early part of his presidential term. I believe 1934, they were part of the National Industrial Recovery Act. It was for civilians, and the defense budget, it was completely outside of the defense budget. It was meant to address the civilian workforce, because the Great Depression had shut down factories, it had shut down shipyards, it had shut down all of these things. When you shut down a shipyard, you have all sorts of these trained workers that you just cut loose. You have the facility that starts to rust on day one, and every day it gets a little bit rustier and a little bit more creaky. And so one of the things about that was he said, look, we've got strategically valuable industrial infrastructure that's sitting and falling apart. So the NERA Act, one of the things that it authorized was the Yorktown and the Enterprise. And they were built and commissioned, and then when all of the stuff in Europe started going sideways in 1938 and 1939, the only American aircraft carrier design available for immediate construction was the Yorktown class. So we built a third, the Hornet. And that was built later. It's the shortest lived aircraft carrier in the American history. I think it was afloat and active for about a year before it got sunk. But those three carriers fought and won the Battle of Midway, and they were Industrial Recovery Act infrastructure projects, civilian projects. And without that, the United States would not have had the naval power necessary to win the Battle of Yorktown, the Battle of Midway. Sorry about that. I was thinking about the carrier that we lost at Midway was the Yorktown. So it's these sort of infrastructure projects. That was 1934 when that was passed. The Battle of Midway was 1942. So July, I believe, June or July. I'd have to look that up. And it was, so 8 years later is when we saw how vital that 1934 Act was. So this kind of thing is incredibly important. And it's happening in Ukraine as well. Boeing is starting a drone plant inside Ukraine. Rheinmetall is, they just opened an armored vehicle depot inside Ukraine and Western Ukraine, specifically to repair vehicles that were sent, like the Gepards and the Leopard tanks. But it will also eventually directly supply perhaps Lynx infantry fighting vehicles. Those are very impressive machines, directly comparable to the Bradleys. There's lots of things like that going on.
What would you say to people who automatically point to or say this is just fat cat billionaires, the elites feeding at the public trough as we continue to feed the military industrial complex?
So let me give you a comparison. They even made that, was it the Pentagon Wars, based on that book about the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle? And it was supposed to be this boondoggle on a waist, and it was just lining rich people's pockets. The most potent weapon that the Americans have produced against Russian T-series tanks is the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. And the Ukrainians are demonstrating this once again. There was that famous video from earlier this year from the Ukrainian village of Stepova, where two Bradleys took on a T-90M tank, Russia's best, and won with 25 millimeter cannons, because they were inside. Any missile has something called a MAR, a minimum abort range, where it can't shoot too close to the vehicle that's shooting it. It's got to have time to arm itself before it's actually useful. So this was close combat between a Bradley and a Russian tank, and the Bradley just tore it up. It lit it up with its 25 millimeter cannon, took out all of its optics. Eventually, it took out the turret rotation mechanism. The tank was still driving, but the turret was just doing this. It was a completely combat ineffective tank. So that was what the naysayers had called an American boondoggle, and it's one of the most potent weapon systems on the planet right now. I will compare this to what Ukraine has captured, especially when they did their big counteroffensive that took back all that land in 2022, and they overran Ukrainian trenches, and they're like, okay, well, we have AKs, maybe we can find some ammunition. So they were doing things like that, and one of the things that they famously found was Russian tanks. They captured a lot of Russian tanks, but they also captured what was supposed to be a lot of like explosives. So whatever the Russians call C4 is what the Americans call it. So whatever the Russians call it, plastic explosives. And so they would. This is another thing, somebody got paid to build this. Somebody has a factory and workers, and people are making money off of it. When the Ukrainians unwrap it, It's all sealed and explosive, beware, and all that kind of stuff. They unwrap it. It's a cheap piece of wood. There's nothing in there. There's no explosives. So if you want to talk about fat cats lining their pockets and corruption, let's do a stark comparison between Russia and the United States, where the United States builds supremely dominant weapon systems. Yes, they're expensive. Yes, people make money off of it. We're a capitalist country. And if people make money, if people have ownership, well, maybe they'll work a little bit harder. But in Russia, the oligarchy, it's basically a mafia country. They'll make money, they'll line their pockets, they'll divert all sorts of stuff. And in that case, they didn't have to even spend money on the ingredients. They just wrapped up a piece of wood and sent it to the military. Russian military has that same problem with helmets that are basically plastic and tinfoil. Their armor vest, where the Kevlar is not Kevlar. Plates are, they'll shatter if you look at them wrong. If you don't know, the plates are the big boron composite plates that are supposed to stop even a heavy rifle shell. And in America, I've worn my battle rattle, and those plates are heavy, and if you have to carry them around, you better trust that they're going to stop something. And yeah, the Russians, they don't have it. So if we're going to talk about corruption, let's talk about Russian corruption. Because while it's true that in America we do have corruption, you can't avoid it. People are going to be people, and bad people are going to do bad things. But we also have a legal system that will go after them. And there are rules about how the military spends money. There's rules about how the military has required quality checks and inventories. There's a reason why we test things, and we fully publicize all of our testing, at least as much as we can. But for instance, the F-35 testing, we publicize all of the failures. Even though that's an incredibly dominant weapon system, we publicized all the problems that we had developing it because it's complicated and it does a lot of cool things. And to get something like that, well, you're going to have some failures. It's the way it is. Elon Musk, to bring up a different name, his Falcon 9 rocket is one of the most successful rockets in the American space industry right now. And he tests to failure. You can watch all of the SpaceX failures, because what he would do is he would design it until it breaks and then figure out what broke and fix it, and then design it until it breaks again. And now we've got an incredibly valuable rocket.
Speaking of accounting and making sure that all the money is tracked, tell us about Ukraine Defense Support, the charitable status, and how you make sure that you provide financial transparency as a charity.
So there's two sides to this. The very simple side of this is that every dollar that Ukraine Defense Support raises goes directly to support the Ukrainian military. The reason that we know this is that the only Ukrainian soldiers and units that we support are the ones that we have direct contact with. So we have vetted contacts. We have videos from the front showing, hey, this is the aid you sent. For instance, I just delivered a 4x4 Toyota truck to a unit that has a friend of mine, and I have video from the unit receiving it and it driving around doing its job. The more complicated side to this is that we attained our 501c3 status in April, and we're still learning what that means because with it comes certain legal responsibilities to be open and transparent with our financials. So we're working on that. We have part of that done, and it's one of our primary projects, and it'll be up on our website as soon as we're done. It's like LinkedIn for charities, something called Candid Guide Star. It'll be up there when we're done. We've already filed various tax forms, but it is important to know even before that, every dollar Ukraine Defense Support was spent on units that we have direct contact with. We personally know them. Our founder spent 6 months fighting for the International Legion of Ukraine. He's a U.S. Army veteran, but he also did combat in Ukraine. So he still supports the International Legion, the people he knows there. When I was in the Air Force, I met various people. This flag, that flag was a 72nd Motor Rifle Regiment. I know 6 people in that unit. I've eaten dinner with their families. I know their kids. So if you send me uniforms or various other items, that's one of the units that'll get them.
Why is it important, in your view, to continue to support Ukraine?
So I mentioned a lot of historic stuff. We are living in one of the historic times. It's one of the clearest moral moments for me in my lifetime. It dawned at the end of my Air Force career. So I retired in 23 and this happened in 22. So it's important to understand how historic and important and consequential what we do right now is. It's been compared a lot, and not just me, to our 1938 moment when Austria was overrun, the Ruhr was overrun, Czechoslovakia was overrun, and what did the world do? We had choices. We made choices, and eventually we won. It was more difficult. We waited a little bit because good people want peace. I get it. But we don't need peace in our time right now. That's not, if you know that quote from 1938, where the British Prime Minister, peace in our time, I have it signed by the man himself, because he had just traveled to Germany. And we can't do peace in our time. That's not an option. One of the things that we learned is that sometimes people can't be negotiated with, people can't be compromised with. They're just people that have to be stopped. So that is the historic moment we are at right now. Maybe we should just transfer right to war crimes, because that's where we are. It's important to understand that from the very opening days, even going back to 2014, a friend of mine, he was a witness to when the Russians sent an artillery shell and blew up a civilian bus in the eastern part of Ukraine. There was no military significance. It was a civilian bus, like you would ride in an American city or a British city. It was just a bus full of civilians just doing whatever they had to do that day. And the Russians blew it up with an artillery shell. So there are things that are small like that. But since 2022, it's just gone into overdrive. The massive invasion with 300,000 or more troops, I think it was halfway to 400,000, if I remember right, was the Russian combat force that they sent in. Since then, the Russian army has committed the war crimes of murder, torture, abductions, deportation of both adults and children, looting, rape against both Ukrainian women, men, and children, terror attacks, attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, attacks on and destruction of cultural centers like churches and auditoriums and historic sites. Just recently in the, can't remember if it was Luhansk or Donetsk district, I'd like to say Donetsk, Russian authorities removed a cultural monument to the Holodomor, which was the genocide in the 1930s. They removed it, they threw it in a dump truck, and they put it in a landfill. So just small things like that are included. Unlawful airstrikes and attacks against civilian objects, wanton destruction, which we can go into further, unlawful confinement, threats of violence, and inhumane treatment of POWs. And that's just bland, almost legal speak. It doesn't account for the videos. It doesn't account for the mass graves. There are two that I am personally connected to. During the assault on Irpin, the Russian forces indiscriminately fired at refugees trying to flee across a bridge that the Russians had collapsed. Now, to be fair and to be accurate, attacking that bridge was not a crime. When you're attacking things like bridges and stuff in the front lines, that is a valid military target. However, any military force has an obligation, a legal obligation towards civilians in the combat zone. And what they did at this bridge, they would just set up infantry units and just random Russian military units, and as civilians were trying to cross the broken bridge, they'd open fire on the civilians. Men, women, children, old people, people with broken legs, wheelchairs, just it didn't matter. They would start opening fire. And it wasn't just small arms. A mortar attack killed a family of 4. People I know were trying to flee on that bridge. They were under fire. They witnessed these war crimes. This is not made up. These have living witnesses. We have the bodies. We have the video. There will be a reckoning. It might not be immediate. The other one that I have a direct connection to was the Izium massacre, and everybody's heard of Bucha, which was horrible. But the Russians only had a couple of months to do their crimes in Bucha, which that was more than 500 civilians. We found the remains of more than 500 in mass graves. And Izium was the same, except in Izium we have so far found more than 1,000 because Russia occupied it more for a longer time. And there are multiple mass graves. There's at least a half dozen that I'm aware of. The remains in the mass graves show signs of torture, execution-style murder, where the hands were bound behind the back and it's a close-range kill to the head, sometimes in the back, sometimes in the temple. Clear signs, and including DNA remains of the rapists for men, women, and children as young as 5 years old. So the horrific crimes are just untold. My personal contact to the Izium massacre is a friend of mine who was a tank commander in the first tanks at Chernihiv. And whenever you're doing such a successful attack as the Ukrainians did in 2022, you push along the line until you find a weak spot, and then you open the hole up in the enemy lines. And then what you have is you've got a unit in reserve, and that unit's job is the breakthrough unit, and they pour through that hole and go behind the lines and just tear apart the enemy military. The American liberation of France in 1944 was such an operation, and so was the 2022 Ukraine counteroffensive. One of my friends commanded a tank in the first tanks out of Chernihiv, who had also just won the Battle of Kiev, and he was one of the units that liberated Izium, and he was one of the first units to come across a mass grave. Unfortunately, he died several weeks later. He got his tank crew out, but he died with his tank. So he was a witness. He sent me video. I have since sent that video to international organizations, including the United States government and the International Red Cross. So these war crimes are documented, and by more people than just me, because there are people on the ground that have a lot more information than I ever did.
So how do you see people like Scott Ritter have been saying that Bucha was not the Russians. He flips it around and says that it was, if I remember correctly, what he was saying at the time was it was Ukraine committing these atrocities. How do you address that kind of pushback?
So one, it's not true. The information is so overwhelming that it's just not even a thing. The only way to counter that is just with the mountains and the mountains of evidence to the contrary. Scott Ritter is not known for being the most honest broker the last several years. Without going into some of it, let's just say that Scott Ritter's got his own problems with, if he had done them in a combat zone, would have been a war crime. So he's not a trustworthy source. That would be one thing. But just the sheer evidence to the contrary, there's just no counter to that. It's a plain fact that the Russian army has committed war crimes in Ukraine and continue to this day.
Yeah, well, I have an article here, Amnesty International.
Is this the infamous Amnesty International from a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, well, they're saying that I don't know which side they're taking on this. I think irrefutable evidence of war crimes. I think they're supporting what you're saying, basically.
So Amnesty International has they've said a couple of weird things, but yes, they have been one of the groups that have documented Bucha specifically.
Yeah.
But it's more than them. It's there's been observers from any number of countries that have gone in there, because as soon as you as soon as you find a mass grave, one of the important things to do is to call in. You got to call somebody. So one of my jobs when I was in the military, personally, I had to study the laws of war, which the Geneva Conventions, it's gone by different names. The International Laws of Armed Conflict, I believe, is the current phrasing. I had to study it personally at least once a year, but whenever I was going into a place like the annual is just basic stuff. The very brief, very shallow overview is the annual training. But anytime you go into a place where you might experience trouble, you might, for instance, the kidnapping an American military person was a threat in some places. And so you had to be aware of your rights and legal duties as a prisoner. But you also had to study the other laws of war. And it's important to understand what these are, because as I talk to people, a lot of people don't know this. And it's weird to me because I spent 22 years where annually I had to have a shallow understanding, but then whenever I went because when I went to Ukraine, it was already a war zone because it was 2017 was the first time I went. Or when I go to the Horn of Africa, or when I went to Tunisia, or when I went to Iraq or Afghanistan, those were all considered hot zones where I had to have a much deeper understanding of what was going on, because it is the responsibility of military members to understand these laws. And it is the responsibility of leaders of nations and militaries to ensure their soldiers know these laws. So as a sergeant, one of my jobs was to make sure that everybody in my unit specifically, and certainly everybody under my supervision, was well aware of these. They had completed the training, they had the basic understanding, because it was important in real world circumstances. So one of the things that people don't even understand is sometimes the generic overview, and I'd like to give. I can send you the links on my sources for this. One of them is the U.S. military, and one of them is the International Red Cross, which is one of the primary Geneva Conventions overseeing authorities, shall we say, for lack of a more accurate. But every war, every law that governs how militaries need to behave and civilians need to behave during war is guided by 5 principles. And one of the things about these, when I say international law, I mean international law, because in America we have a treaty system where when we ratify and sign a treaty under our Constitution, once the Senate ratifies and the President signs, it is literally U.S. law. That treaty becomes U.S. law. And this is true for any of the signatories, because that was one part of the treaty, is that when you sign on to this treaty, it becomes the law of your nation. And if you break this law, there are consequences. One of the basic underpinnings is that while there are specific circumstances that they detail, specific, like this action is specifically a war crime, one of the parts of this law is that the listing of specifics is not intended and should never be taken to understand that other things will not be war crimes that are not specifically listed. And the legal framework for that are these 5 principles. That's why they're so important, because they underpin every single specific crime, but they also are supposed to be a relatively easy thing to remember when you are operating in a military manner. A military needs to understand this. When they're considering an action, they need to understand, okay, how do these considerations affect me? To the extent where some military units have lawyers there, that their specialty is international law and the laws of armed conflict. And so just not to belabor it too much, the first one is military necessity. That is, your actions need to be justified and necessary in order to defeat the enemy. And here is, so it needs to be necessary to defeat the enemy, but it also needs to be as quickly and efficiently as possible. So that's almost very specific when you're looking at what you're doing. Can you draw it out? No, you can't. Can you do wanton destruction where you don't need to? No, you can't. Can it be something that you're going to do and it'll be going after something that isn't necessarily going to defeat the enemy? Well, probably not. It's relatively easy to make the case that it'll help, but there's some circumstances that it wouldn't. The flip side of this is that humanity, this is the second principle, is humanity, forbids actions unnecessary to achieve the military objective. The third one is proportionality. This is one that gets people a lot. This is when actions may be required and necessary to defeat the enemy. They may be required under military necessity. Such actions cannot be unreasonable or excessive. The blow-up of the dam over the Dnieper River is one example. This was specifically made, the attacks on dams like the Dnieper and any sort of nuclear power plant were specifically made war crimes in 1977. So when the Russian tanks ran into that Zaporizhzhia nuke plant, guns a-blazing, shooting in the direction of the actual reactor vessels, that was a war crime. It was just people with AKs and general armored vehicles. It was still a war crime. But the blowing of the dam was flat out a war crime. Distinction is the next one. This is one that when we're talking about the Bucha massacre and the cultural centers and all that kind of stuff, that's what this one comes under. This underpins the party's responsibility to behave with military necessity, humanity, and proportionality. It requires the parties in a conflict to recognize and respect certain civilian legal categories, as well as military categories. For instance, medical personnel that are identified with a Red Cross armband or some sort of "I'm obviously a medic" badge. Those are protected. They are not combatants. They are not legal targets. Chaplains are the other category. Those are the only two categories protected, that uniform military categories. Principally the distinction between armed forces and civilian population. That's what distinction is. You literally, according to the laws of war, you cannot attack civilians. So that bridge that I was talking about, they were attacking civilians. It's flat out a war crime. There's just no way around that. We have all the proof that we need. And the last one is honor. And this one is also something that's a little bit more subtle than people give it credit for. It supports the entire system and gives parties confidence in it. The thing about honor that, I mean, it sounds like, okay, what does that actually mean? The nation conducting military operations in accordance with the laws of war must have a system in place to investigate, to have war crimes observed. When somebody observes a war crimes, there must be a system to report it. There must be a system to investigate it, and there must be a system to prosecute it. That's one of the requirements for the principle of honor. And Russia doesn't have that right now. They're not reporting war crimes further. They are lying about them. They are doing it through proxies, like Scott Ritter and others. RT is full of this kind of lie all the time. Even a journalistic, they're an outshoot of the Russian government, but even they are guilty of war crimes when they spread these kinds of lies. So it's important. I can go into more specifics if you want, but those 5 principles, if people take nothing else out of this, military necessity, humanity, proportionality, distinction, and honor. And every single combatant needs to know those. That's actually a legal requirement of the Geneva Conventions.
The Russians turn around and accuse Ukraine of war crimes. I mean, it doesn't matter what war you're looking at. Both sides accuse the other side of war crimes. Most recently, what comes to mind is this claim that the Sevastopol beach was hit with cluster munitions dropped by an ATACMS missile. And this was the video that was used as the evidence of that. I have to say, I thought from the very beginning this video was a little weird, but this is what it looked like. I couldn't really see anything here.
So, yeah, there's a couple of things. I want to point out up front that if there is an accusation, it must be investigated. And even if it comes from the Russians. So if there is an accusation, it will be investigated. So that up front, that doesn't mean they'll find anything. And there are certain actions that you sometimes need to attack a military target, and there will be civilian casualties. That does not make it a war crime necessarily. It is possibly a war crime, but it isn't automatically a war crime. So I do know that those Sevastopol beaches are very close to a military airstrip. They're very close to SAM missile systems, S-300 and S-400.
Yep.
I don't know precisely where that beach is, if it's near the port. I don't know. It might be, it might not be. But I do know that there is a military airfield with S-400, S-300 SAM systems that are more or less right on the beach. So if they were going after the airfield or the SAM systems, or for that matter, there's beach defenses, those are valid targets. And Ukraine would have to be careful in attacking them. But like I said, when a military does things right, people die. When a military does things wrong, the wrong people die. So could it have been a missed missile that hit civilians? Maybe. I don't know. Does it need to be investigated? Yes. Will they find crimes? Maybe, maybe not. So the military necessity, humanity, proportionality, distinction, and honor all apply. So my upfront thing about honor, if there's an accusation, it must be investigated. Just flat up. I would fully support an investigation of every single report.
Okay. I mean, I have to say, like, I don't honestly know what to make of video like this. It's blurred.
Yeah.
And then
I didn't actually
cluster munitions. Like, okay, I see stuff.
So
that
does look like a pattern for a cluster munition, but it also doesn't look like it's on the civilian portion of the beach. So if the military target was nearby, I can tell you that I'd need geolocation. I'd need more information to know what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always it's wise to not make claims or draw conclusions with incomplete information.
Yes. So the other thing you have to remember about the laws of war is that it's not just for the side doing the attacking, it's also for the side doing the defending. I will give you an example of, I don't know how much press this actually got. It was big inside the military because it happened while I was active duty, where there was an operation conducted by American Special Forces where one of their things was one of their combatants put on a medic insignia and went and conducted lethal kinetic action against his target. That was a war crime. That was a court-martial offense in the United States military. So that's one example of American, that was the wrong choice, and that was a legal problem, and yes, he was court-martialed for it. And rightly so. But the things that you have to remember is that the defender also has responsibilities. So for instance, you cannot Hospitals are protected. A church is protected. A school is protected. A cultural center like a monument or like a historic building, like a 1,000-year-old building or something, all of that UNESCO site, those things are protected. But if you are the defender and you set up a military position inside of a church, that church is a target now. You negated its protected status. So if there is, and like I said, I need the geolocation because I know that there is a Russian airfield that conducts offensive strikes against Ukraine right on the beach in Crimea, right near Sevastopol. And so if there's a civilian beach right there, or if those people on the beach are, because the military sometimes has recreational places, so if there were people on the beach and they worked at the base, they aren't even necessarily civilian targets anymore if they work on the base. I don't care if they're actually on the job, they're still a target. So I have questions about that video is I guess where I'd have to leave that.
Yeah, well, they've been criticized by some for putting people on the beach in harm's way because the beach is surrounded by military targets.
And that's what I'm saying. If you are conducting a hot war like is going on right now, it's a big war. Russia has like 450,000 troops in combat, and Ukraine has a similar number. That's a big war. And if you have civilians on the beach right next to a military target, I have questions.
And there were conflicting reports. Initially, we were told here that it was the United States was responsible because they supplied the ATACMS, and the attack appeared to be intentional and cluster munitions were used. But when I'm looking at that video, I'm seeing kind of a mixed bag. And then we're seeing other reports come out that say the missile was actually shot down, and that was
I'd have questions about that too.
I don't know.
It appeared to be a circular pattern from a standard ATACMS cluster munitions warhead. I'm not really an expert, but from the video that I've seen, that looked like it was a standard circle pattern from ATACMS. Yeah.
But cluster munitions from the video I've seen in the past are devastating, and it didn't look like they were detonating.
And that's why I'm looking at that's why I need to look at the geolocation, not just for the beach but also for where we saw that pattern, because I don't know if you're aware, but that pattern is not small, and we saw almost the entire circle in the distance, so the camera angle was far enough away that you could see nearly the entire pattern. So how close was it? So the other side, we're spending a lot of time on this. I get it, because there's Russian disinformation. We need to counter that. But when you're talking about this, where maybe it is, maybe it isn't, we'd need more investigation to even know. And there's not enough information in the video outside of geolocation. Versus mass graves in Bucha and Izium, Russian soldiers that publish video on social media about how they're torturing civilians and military prisoners. There is a video out there of a Russian soldier who captured a Ukrainian, the poor Ukrainian's alive on the ground, somebody sitting on him. His hands are bound with zip ties, and he's pleading for his life, and this Russian soldier knifes open his pants and castrates him while he's still alive. That's what a Russian soldier puts on Russian social media. A clear war crime, and they're bragging about it. So when we're talking about, okay, who's committing crimes here? Now, will Ukraine always make the right choice? Will their munitions always go where they're aimed? Will they make mistakes? Yes. But it's the difference between we made a bad call or the munition went astray and we're sorry, and we'll make amends when we can, versus a coordinated and everybody doesn't care. The Russian military obviously has no honor according to the laws of war. And by that, I'm not meaning a moral critique. I'm meaning a legal accusation. The Russian military has no honor according to the laws of war in the legal definition.
And is it your position that if Ukraine is found to have committed war crimes, that they should be investigated and held accountable as well?
It is the responsible of each and every member of the military who witnesses a war crime to report the incident. Now, I am not a lawyer, and while I've been required to teach and understand the laws of armed conflict from a military perspective, it was my responsibility to understand that from a military perspective. I'm also not a lawyer. So in terms of, is that a war crime, is that not, sometimes it's incredibly clear, there's no debate. But sometimes you would need to call in a lawyer. So, for instance, that video, that needs to be handed to a lawyer, and I'd have to look it up. But it obviously hasn't made a lot of the other media where I'm watching. But yes, it would need to be investigated. If there is an incident that Ukraine committed that is actually a war crime, that needs to be investigated and prosecuted. Like I said on the American example that I gave, the operator committed a war crime. He was accused and he was court-martialed, and that's the way it works because the American military has honor and the Ukrainian military does as well. So any war crimes should be reported. Any possible war crimes should be reported. If they are in fact crimes, yes, they should be prosecuted. That is my position.
And the American military has been held accountable for,
yes,
as
they should.
Yes, and
yeah,
but when it comes to enforcing, or actually, when it comes to enforcement, it becomes difficult because Russia, the United States, not actually members of the International Criminal Court or the ICJ, and
sure.
then when Russia releases video like this, and I'll warn people that this is quite graphic, but the Russians actually released this video of a person they're calling a terrorist from Tajikistan following that Crocus terrorist attack, where I think it was, a lot of people were killed in that theater. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a massacre.
Is this the recent one in Moscow, I'd like to say?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they chased these suspects down, and I'll run this, but again, I just want to caution everybody, this is quite graphic.
Before you say that, before you run the video, it is actually an interesting point that in one incident, it is possible for there to be war crimes on both sides. If that indeed was a terrorist attack, that was a war crime as well.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And okay, so you guys ready for this? Are you okay?
Oh.
Anybody? All right, I'm going to run this, and hopefully we don't get banned on YouTube. I hope it's going to run. Here we go. It's not playing off the hard drive. I'll tell you what, folks, let me re-cue these because I think we sat so long that the hard drive went to sleep. So let me take a little break, okay?
Okay.
And we'll come back and we'll run this video, and it'll give you guys plenty of time to prepare.
Someone very profoundly once said many years ago that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on Earth.
The entire world is watching.
Every dictator, every crazy dictator in the world is watching.
The world is watching. On TV, the entire world is watching. On social media.
But the entire world is watching, and yes, they are seeing what we have apparently bravely been willing to say that others are thinking.
Stand for freedom. Literally stand for freedom. Let's get this done. The entire world is watching.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars.
Maverick News. Maverick News. Maverick News.
Let me have more control of my own destiny.
The world is watching.
Okay, we're back, and I have a couple of clips here, and keep in mind that it's the Russians releasing this footage, I think, to send a message to
Now, and
anybody.
also,
Yeah.
to be clear, it is a purported to be a terrorist that they captured, and the soldiers that have captured him are Russian. And I have something specific to say after this.
Okay, so here's the first clip. There we go. This is him after his ear had been cut. And I'll pull this down. And this is another clip also from the same incident, same suspect. And they, again, they're cutting his ear off, and then they feed it to him or stuff it in his mouth. And keep in mind, this is the Russians shooting this and then posting it on social media themselves. It's not like, it's not me finding some undercover stuff. They wanted people to see this, so there it is.
Let me read you directly from the Geneva Convention of 1949, Article 4. Persons who do not take a direct part or who have ceased to take part in hostilities are entitled to respect. In all circumstances, they are to be treated humanely. Protocol 2 specifically prohibits violence to the life, health, and physical or mental well-being of people. In particular, it prohibits acts of murder and cruel treatment, terrorism, hostage-taking, slavery, outrages on personal dignity, collective punishment, and pillage. These protections are considered fundamental guarantees for all persons. One of the rules that the American military is taught is that while they're a combatant, they're a fair target. Once you capture them, they are your responsibility. Any harm that comes to those POWs, any harm that comes to your prisoner, whether whatever the source, once they become your prisoner, they are under your care. They are your responsibility. Anything that happens to that prisoner is your legal responsibility. So not only had this person been taken prisoner, whether or not he was a combatant or not, that I can't answer. But even if he was a combatant that had committed a war crime, an act of terrorism, once he became a prisoner, he fell under the protections of Geneva. And any violation of that was a war crime.
So I want to share this with the audience too. Just as I think this is an important note. This took place during Purim. No, I've never heard anybody even talk about this, but I've been aware of this information from the beginning. It took place during Purim, Jewish festival. And Purim is connected to the story of Haman, which is the story of I'm not an expert on the history of it, but basically this is the story of about trying to exterminate the Jews. And here, let me just pull up a couple of notes here. So the story set in ancient Persia. It's the story of Mordecai, who is Esther's cousin. Basically, the tradition of eating Haman's ears during Purim comes from the custom of eating triangular pastries, or Hamanstaschen, which means Haman's pockets in Yiddish, and these pastries are referred to as Haman's ears. And I think that I can't help but think that because it happened in Purim, and these guys are coming from Tajikistan, it's like it seems like there's some connection to what's going on in Israel, and cutting the ear off in Purim, and then it's like I'm not doing very well with this, but it was like they were feeding Haman's ears to somebody that they were kind of suggesting was maybe a Zionist at the time. It was like, here, you Jewish sympathizer, eat your Haman's ears, eat your own Haman's ear.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I was not aware of that connection. I do know that I'm not an expert on what's happening between Israel and Hamas right now. So
Yeah.
you can ask me questions, but I'm going to have to say I'm not an expert and to talk to somebody else. But the part that I do know is that Iran and Russia are currently attached at the hip. And Iran is the primary supplier and supporter and in every way, military and financially, of Hamas. So that they're connected, I don't know for sure. It's highly likely, but that's as much as I want to step on that.
Yeah, I know, and it's volatile, right? But Haman wanted the Jews destroyed, and that's why you have this tradition of eating Haman's ears, because his ears were cut off in the story, and this is what happened when they captured those suspects, and that in itself. Now, so I can push that aside. You've got the point, right? And there's it just seems like there's a connection to Iran, to the rise in anti-Semitism. We've seen that all over the place, including in Russia. But it is absolutely a war crime in my estimation. But then you saw Vladimir Putin turn around and sign a proclamation after displaying these prisoners in court, not with that injury, but all of them had been clearly assaulted and injured. And he just signed a proclamation absolving, giving immunity to all of the soldiers who had against war crimes.
So one of the things to remember about the whole subject is that it is the individual soldier's responsibility to know and behave properly. It is their supervising sergeant or whatever the next rank, it's their responsibility to not only ensure that people under them know it, but are acting in accordance. It is the responsibility for the officers over them. The unit commanders are also responsible. The generals above those unit commanders, the head general is responsible. And whatever leadership, for instance, Vladimir Putin's government, when he's doing something like that, when he's giving a blank amnesty to war criminals, that is a problem. That is one of the data points when I literally say that the Russian military has no honor legally. That is one of the points. The Russian system is either incapable or unwilling to prosecute or even take seriously war crimes, and in fact they encourage it. One thing that they even brag about, the Russian sources say that I'm finding the actual Geneva Convention while I'm talking. So the Russian sources flat out say that at least 700,000 Ukrainian children have been taken from Ukraine into Russia. Aside from the human trafficking of children, this is also a war crime under the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Children are to be evacuated to safe areas and reunited with their families. It can't be clearer than that. Kidnapping them and taking them to Russia and putting them into foster families is just straight up. There's no argument there. And Russia is bragging about that. And we're not talking about a couple of dozen, it's a problem, but it's not a huge problem. We're talking about the Russian government bragging about 700,000 Ukrainian children. That's not small.
That is actually a fact. And I mean, the Russian government is saying, well, they're keeping the children safe. But you could argue that is in itself a cultural genocide, because those children are
That's
being
fully
taken.
their intent, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that gets into other things that I don't have the actual article up for, but yes, you are correct. It is a violation of more than one article of the International Laws of War.
And and I'm going to say something here, and this is not going to sit well with my audience, but I don't care. Tucker Carlson, I know he's very popular with our audience, but I just watched a video from a couple of days ago, I think. I'm not sure of the date, but he came out and he said, and I'm always worried when someone is saying everything that the mainstream media tells you, everything they say is a lie. Not everything.
Well, you already know
maybe.
That's a lie, because all it needs is one contradiction for that statement to be false.
That's right.
So if they say something, you already don't trust it.
So he's saying everything they tell you is a lie. And then he said that Ukraine is not a democracy. And one of the reasons it's not a democracy and not a free society is because they have been shutting down Russian Orthodox churches inside Ukraine for, in his words, no reason at all. But I think that's a false statement.
It's absolutely a false statement.
There's a reason. It's not for no reason at all. There's a reason. What do you think the reason is?
So you remember when I said that if a nation tries to use a protected status like a church or a member of the clergy, if they try and misuse that to gain military advantage, that in itself is a war crime. Vladimir Putin has, for several decades, and he's not the only one. The Soviets did it. That's probably where he learned it, because he was a KGB guy. Stalin did it in World War II all the time. And the Tsars did it before Stalin. So this is not a new Russian thing. The Russian Orthodox Church is an arm of the Russian government, and that's just a plain fact. When you're in Europe and you're trying to counter Russian disinformation, one of my examples is I led a group on a mission to Serbia, which is traditionally been a Russian ally, although there's some question right now whether I can't remember how to pronounce their leader's name, and I can picture him in my mind. I even met the guy, but he's been making overtures to the West, and maybe it's softening between the West and Serbia. But at the time, it was clearly a Russian ally when I went. And the Russian government pours money into allied nations, and Serbia has some infrastructure issues, to put a delicate touch on it. There's buildings with problems. They have problems with clean water, food control, all kinds of problems that you might have when there's not enough money and there's too much corruption. But that Russian Orthodox Church was stunning, and all of that work had been completed inside of the last 10 years. So they use the Russian Orthodox Church to get into the country, shall we say, and then you're playing on the citizens' deeply held religious beliefs, because the believers were trying to come to it honestly, but then you've got the clergy that are controlled by the Russian Orthodox prelate that's part of the government, and so it's kind of a problem. This is not new historically either. Europe's had a lot of problems with this, without going into too much detail, but this is not a new Russian problem. The Russian Orthodox Church was definitely a problem. There were incidences of Russian Orthodox priests sending information back. In the initial stages of the invasion, they were trying to conduct incidences of sabotage, or at least, hey, this is the place you need to attack. The actions of the Russian Orthodox Church have, in many cases, violated their protected status. Now, going back to the principles, when you're trying to counter that, you have to take into account, humanity and distinction and proportionality. So, would each and every Russian Orthodox priest be guilty? No, you can't say that. Would the buildings be liable for attack? No. But Ukraine had very, very real and justified reasons for breaking the Ukrainian church's ties to the Russian prelate. And it was because the Russian prelate was becoming an active participant in the war against Ukraine. And so in some ways, the Russian Orthodox Church became a combatant.
Well, I'm all about peace, and I'd like for the conflict to come to an end, but I'm also strongly of the opinion that you can't get to a meaningful peace without truth. And if you if it's and it's really just that simple. So that's why I'm calling out some of these inconsistencies and outright lies. There are reasons why some of these things are done, and for any media person to sit there and say there's no reason at all for something, that to me is just an outright propaganda.
I can say that I'm highly disappointed in some famous journalists from America, without naming names because there's more than one. The information's out there. I can send you these links that talk about what the military teaches about the laws of war, what the International Red Cross is, the actual language of the treaties. It's not hard to find. It's out there. The simple Google search away. All of the American military documents are public domain. There's nothing classified there, and anything that the military has that's not classified or otherwise needing to be kept to certain eyes is public knowledge. So there's nothing secret about the laws of the international laws of war because they are U.S. law. We signed the treaty. The language is in a Senate bill. It's just, it's all out there. So when people are giving this information out that's wrong, they are misinterpreting, they're misrepresenting, or they're just making stuff up. Or they're blowing it out of proportion, like that video that appears to show the civilian beach. Well, it's a little out of proportion. The claims are a little bit high for what I saw. Quite a bit high. Mm-hmm. I'm highly disappointed, not only that the journalists and the other famous people like Scott Ritter, they put out these things that are just plain wrong. It's also a problem because some viewers, some listeners, some fans of these people take them at their word. I did think it was funny. I'm going to quote Zelensky again just because it was such a great quote. Because he was interviewed during the NATO summit by Brett Baer of Fox News, who sometimes says things that are not true, but he's at least one of the more honest ones, where Baer asked Zelensky if he was informed about American politics. And Zelensky shot back, and you have to applaud him for this. I think sometimes we are closer than you, Brett. And that was a bit of a mic drop. So viewers have to understand the sources that they're looking at. Anybody that thinks Scott Ritter is an honest actor needs to look up Scott Ritter and what he's done, both good and bad, because he was not always this way. Tucker Carlson, they should understand he has no military experience. He was never a foreign policy expert. He's smart. That's one of the problems. He's a smart guy. And he either failed to do his research or he decided that the truth didn't matter. And it was what he said was, the viewers need to understand that. I personally try and read, listen, or watch something every single day that I disagree with. There's several reasons for that. One is I might be wrong, and any honest person should understand that they might be wrong. The other reason is I need to get out of my bubble, that if there is something that my bubble is ignoring or just didn't make it in, it's kind of my job to know about it as a concerned citizen and advocate and somebody trying to do the right thing. It's kind of my job to find a little bit of information that doesn't exist in my bubble. And the other thing is if I am hearing what they are saying. So, for instance, there's a lady that helpfully translates RT and broadcasts those videos on Twitter, and I watch RT because I want to know what they're saying. So if knowing what is out there that's wrong and being aware of what's going on is important as well, because knowing how to counter it and knowing what truths are out there that are just making that plain false, that's important. So any listener, and I encourage myself every day. I encourage you, Rick. I encourage anybody listening to this podcast, really get a varied diet on the news that you consume. Get official sources, get nonpartisan sources, just get everything. And know what you're listening to, know the background of who's actually trying to give you information. Mm-hmm. It just be a very honest consumer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I've always said here too. And as a journalist, it's my job to talk to everybody. It's my job to try to get people closer to the truth by exploring a variety of, all angles of a story, all sides of a story, not just two sides, but all sides. But at the same time, it's difficult right now to navigate through
Mm-hmm.
what is truth and what is an outright lie. So
The truth is out there,
Yeah,
but
it's somewhere.
X-Files. Truth is out there. But sometimes it's a little harder to dig, but sometimes people ignore the easy sources. Like all of these claims about war crimes. And this is one of the things that surprised me talking to people about Russian war crimes. They don't even understand those 5 basic principles that govern what we're talking about. So the very basic grounding to understand the subject isn't there. And when I hear people like Tucker Carlson, or somebody that really should know better is Scott Ritter, misstate these things, that they're obviously misstating things from a very basic level, and you're just like, it's like trying to talk about math and you're saying that 2 + 2 = 3, and you're just like, yeah, you're not there, not even close. Like what you said is so bad it doesn't even qualify as wrong, is one of those scientific. I'm paraphrasing; it's not quite a quote.
Well, I've seen the rhetoric just amplify itself over time as the conflict has continued. Everything is in absolute terms. Ukraine has no chance of winning.
Which is
being
obviously
devastated.
false.
Yeah,
which is true.
Constantly, just and everything they're telling you is a lie. Everything. Those kinds of absolute statements.
Mm-hmm.
That is the stuff that
automatically
sends up a red flag for me.
Yeah, well, anytime somebody makes a blanket statement, it's ironically for the phrasing, anytime somebody makes a blanket statement, they're always wrong. And yes, you are allowed to laugh at that statement. But it's just a decent rule of thumb that if somebody says everything and there's absolutely no chance, or anything that's that coherent, it only takes one contradiction to be false. So every time somebody says that, bet on it being false. You'll be right more often than not. I would like to make a quick comment. I know this wasn't our subject, but on the state of the war, because I've been studying the thing around Kharkiv and the thing around Avdiivka lately. And of course, Russia has a very long history of bragging about things that they have no chance of being able to do. The Russian army in May, June, and now into July has been losing at least 1,000 soldiers every single day. And sometimes it's close to 2,000. It's often 1,500. So in the months of May and June, well over 40,000 Russian soldiers were lost each one of those months. Russia has all these claims about, we'll put millions of soldiers into uniform. But Russia currently only has the ability, we talked about infrastructure, to put between 20 and 30,000 soldiers into the army every month. Because anytime you take a raw recruit, you got to at least give them a uniform and some basic training. That's why the American military calls it basic training. But anyone that's been through basic training knows the meaning of the word basic there. You're being processed into the military, just in terms of paperwork. You're getting your very first uniforms. You're getting some very basic understanding of the chain, the various rank structure. It's all incredibly basic. And the amount of information that you're getting on actually how to do your job in terms of actually contributing to the fight, you're not getting very much of that in basic training. You're going to get an initial introduction to the use of the very common weapons and to hand-to-hand combat. But when I say initial basic introduction, I mean initial basic introduction. There's only so much you can do in a short number of weeks. So the Russian basic training is about 4 weeks right now, and they're only getting 20 to 30,000 soldiers through 4 weeks of training. So when they get to the front after 4 weeks of training, that's not an effective soldier, not even close. Air Force basic training, I don't know what it currently is, but it used to be 8.5 weeks, close to 9 weeks. And that's the shortest American basic training out there. And after basic training, the Air Force sends you to what they call tech school, where you're going to spend anywhere from 6 months to 2 years learning your actual job. So sending troops to the front after 4 weeks, and that's where the Russians are right now. We have documented sources of Russia losing at least 3,000 tanks. And they can produce a certain number every month. They might be able to put out 100 brand new T-90Ms a year, maybe. Probably less than that with sanctions. And even the ones they do put out, if they're getting secondary black market or just garbage components on their electronics, they might not be a great tank or even a workable tank. Everything else they're drawing out of storage. And last I checked, Russia was nearly out of their T-90, T-80, and T-72 tanks. They were entirely out, at least one of the sources I read, they were entirely out of their reserve stored T-80 and T-90 tanks, and almost out of their T-72s. And the T-72s, that's what they had the most of. What that means is that before the end of 2024, all Russia is going to have in storage are incredibly old tanks. We are talking T-54, 55. Those were the ones that were designed in 1945, that fought in the Korean War, and they were brand new in the Korean War. T-62s that were in the late 50s, I mean. Those are, 70-year-old tanks? 80-year-old tanks? And that's all Russia's going to have left soon. The staggering amount of Russian losses and their ability to make good those losses is an interesting question right now. And so they can't sustain their numbers on the front. They don't have the infrastructure to put the soldiers through training. Even the training they do is utterly insufficient. 4 weeks. The equipment they have is not sufficient. The command structure they have is not sufficient. There's a reason why when Russia tried to attack near Kharkiv, the Ukrainians pushed them back, and the Ukrainians might even push into Russia on that front. There's a reason why the Russian army spent 9 months in the Avdiivka direction, gaining, 30 miles, maybe? I think somebody did the math on that, and at the rate of the Russian advance in the eastern part, not their retreat in the Kharkiv part, but their advances in the eastern part, it'll take them something like 150 years to conquer Ukraine at this rate, losing 1,000 soldiers every day. So in terms of Ukraine can't win, really? So, I mean, in some terms, Ukraine has already gutted the Russian military in a lot of ways. So, can Ukraine win? Yes. Do they need our help? Yes. But can Russia win? I have my doubts right now. They have the mass, but they've been so gutted and so... Ukraine has punched so far above their weight in this war. The staggering impact on Russia's military due to Ukrainian grit, determination, and creative action is just astonishing. For me, they've earned my support long since. And I can't say this enough. Russia has no honor. So if anybody is looking to support Ukraine and maybe will take me seriously, and I'll tell you to do your research, but yes.
And I mean, I don't want to rehash what we talked about too much in the last appearance here with you, but you know, Ukraine, just like Russia, having challenges with manpower on, you know, boots on the ground,
Yep.
and with the high levels of casualties on both sides, especially on Ukraine, that's becoming an issue.
It is, and I'm hesitating because I have information that's probably governed by OPSEC, which is Operational Security. So I am not. It was given to me in confidence, so I'm not going to repeat it.
Okay.
But the public sources that I can talk about in the Avdiivka I can't talk. In the Avdiivka direction, there's a lot of harsh consonants there. There were a lot of operations where Russia and Ukraine, anytime you talk about a battle, so like in the Battle of Midway that we talked about much earlier, the Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers and something like 350 aircraft and their trained pilots. The Americans lost 1 aircraft carrier and maybe 80 airplanes and pilots, and they recovered a lot of the pilots. So that was so lopsided, 4-1 on ships and a bit bigger on the pilots, because I think we only lost 30 or 40. So the rest of them, we turned the pilots back into a new plane. So when you're talking about the Avdiivka direction, I set myself up for that one. There were many days where for every 10 soldiers that Ukraine took out, 10 Russian soldiers that Ukraine took out, Ukraine was maybe losing 1, because defense is always the advantage, even in the face of artillery and all that kind of stuff. You're dug in. They don't necessarily know precisely where you are. You're not on the move, so you have protection that's right there. You don't have to move through minefields. So one of the things, and we might have hit this last time, is that even if Russia tried to clear a minefield, one of the weapons that America supplied to Ukraine was an artillery-delivered minefield. So as soon as Russia clears a path through a minefield, you can launch some shells and drop mines on that path that the Russians thought they cleared. So when they try and drive their tanks over it, that would be why Russia will lose 5, 10, 20 armored vehicles trying to attack, and all countless numbers of soldiers. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians they're taking shots at them. So yes, the Russian artillery will take out some, but when you're talking about the balance here, Russia is 4 times as big as Ukraine, but if the loss rates are 10-1 and Russia has a demographic problem anyway, their military age males are their smallest demographic. Yeah. I don't want to say Ukraine's winning, but they're doing a real good job.
Yeah. And while all that's going on, people are still talking about peace. You know, I've seen, I have to say, I find it odd, a little bit odd, that RFK Jr. keeps coming out and sort of blames Ukraine for the failure of peace, or maybe more specifically, he blames the United States and Britain for throwing a monkey wrench into Vladimir Putin's peace offers, which I think, in the course of this, there may have been peace offers, but I'm not sure that they've been entirely sincere. Maybe a little disingenuous at times.
Can I reframe that? So
sure.
When Russia says, well, let's have peace, and we want to keep Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea, and Kherson, those are the 4 that we want. But so the Russian army has proven incapable of making serious inroads the last 2 years. In some cases, they even got pushed back, like in Kharkiv recently. But they want peace and they want to keep the lands that they had. So this is very disingenuous, right? Mm-hmm. So when you look at it, the Russians will talk a big game, but they're actually negotiating from a position of weakness right now. They want to hold on to their territorial gains and protect their war criminals, but they don't want... You see what I'm saying here is that there's something wrong here. The other part of it is that in 1939, when the Germans went into Poland, should we have made peace there? Like, oh, you can keep Poland. We just want peace. I mean, you can keep Poland. Yeah, how does that even make sense on a moral standpoint? So I don't quite get the peace thing.
Yeah, I mean, I do see both sides. I understand.
I get it. And Americans are very tired of war. I get that too.
Yeah.
But there's a very simple end to this war. Russia can just take its soldiers and go home. They can keep the remaining soldiers that they have. They can just go home. There's one party that's responsible for this conflict, and that's Russia. And trying to talk about peace and who's at fault, well, if Russia took their toys and went home, we'd have peace. One thing that you did bring up, Hungary, you showed that on the picture.
I wanted to just dig into
This is one of those current events, and it's not this specific news story, but sometime in the last day or two, Ukraine cut off half of Hungary's oil supply because Hungary gets most of its energy from Russia still, and it flows through pipelines that go from Russia to Hungary through Ukraine. When you're talking about a military target, that Hungary, the money from a nation that's not currently at war with Ukraine and technically is supposed to be on the side of NATO, that's helping Ukraine, but they are financing the Russian war material because the only Russian export right now is oil. Yeah, that's pretty legit to shut down that pipeline. So Hungary is, they're talking about their national reserves already, but they're going to have to start talking about shutting down their power supply within the next 90 days. Sometimes, in some cases, maybe in the next couple of weeks. So when you're talking about Orban's Hungary, maybe that's not the most honest actor. So I can understand them moving high-level meetings out of Budapest. The other side of that is that if Orban was a conduit to Russia, and we're giving that up, I understand why the diplomats were trying to use Hungary as a tunnel into Russia. Somebody that the Russians would actually talk to, I get. But,
yeah. Well, he just did that whirlwind peace tour, right? Mm-hmm. Do you think that there was anything positive that came out of that? It seemed to me like it sort of fell flat.
It did, and for the same reasons that I'm talking about. Russia is incapable of making serious gains on the battlefield right now. And when they try, they just take horrendous losses for minimal gains. Some people have called it strategically insignificant. They really haven't captured anything big the last 9 months. And then they're trying to talk about, well, okay, we can't really win, but we want to win through negotiations. We'll lie to you and we'll negotiate peace, and maybe we can win that way, even though we can't actually win, or we're going to have to struggle so much winning that, so there's a reason it fell flat. Nobody's buying what he's selling.
Yeah. And I mean, I've been critical of the Ukrainian government here. I don't like, the list of journalists that they target.
Ukraine citizens are often critical of the Ukraine government,
sure.
even when they support it. So there's reasons for that.
And I'm critical of Russia as well, because they have an American journalist in custody right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
The famous one from, I'd like to say, the Wall Street Journal.
Gershkovich.
Thank you for the name. It wasn't popping into my head.
Yeah. And we've called that out too. So I'm not popular. I'm in the middle of the road getting run over all the time. But you know, that's my job, and that just comes with the territory. I'm just trying to be fair and balanced. And I have to say, Mike, tonight I think that everything you've been saying has been honestly pretty balanced. You're not sitting there saying, "Don't listen to those guys. Everything they're telling you is a lie." I haven't heard that even once from you.
I specifically told you not to trust somebody that says that. So, just as a a general piece of research advice, that you don't trust anything until you can verify it. So, I know I've been talking a lot. I didn't know if you wanted to go to any audience questions. I didn't know if there were any.
We can. I can.
It's up to you. Here. I've got more to talk about, but
sure.
Sometimes I get sick of my own voice.
Do you guys have any questions? I can. I'll look in the Rumble chat as well. Let's just see here.
If anyone wants this shirt, this is an example of Ukrainian grit and determination and ingenuity.
Yeah, Grizzly 2 Sucks says, no surprise, Rick is very pro-Russia in his coverage. Well, we've had a lot of, pro-Russian people on the show. No question about that.
I would say, and I told you that I watch I've got like 3 words of Russian, so I need the translator, but I watch RT to know what the Russians are saying.
Sure.
And also I watch RT so that when I hear what RT is saying, and then I hear the exact same words coming out of somebody else's mouth, I know that they're just repeating the Russian talking points.
Yeah. And what was it here? This is too much for air. Rick thinks this guy is balanced. He needs his scales checked. Okay.
Did that person have a question or a specific comment?
No, I think I just like to I just like to highlight the people who attack me.
Well, I would say if they have, some people just want to grumble, but if they actually have a specific question, then we can address it. Otherwise, they're just grumbling.
Yeah. So.
That's the nice version of the sergeant in me talking about how people grumble. Let's just say if I was active duty, my language would be a bit harsher and probably censored.
Yeah, give me a question here, guys. Don't just sit there and spout off. Any questions? Well, what else do you want to talk about, Mike?
It's up to you. I mean, we did... a week ago we were talking about the NATO summit. That's kind of old news. I would want to mention kind of like the laws of war that people just don't have a basic understanding about. People sometimes lack a basic understanding of what NATO is. And like any organization...
But let's hold off on that for a moment.
Okay.
I do have somebody on the line, one of our regulars, and this is John Scotty from out in Western Canada in Alberta. And John, go ahead. You're on the air. You have a question for Mike?
I do, Mike. Mike, may God bless you. I really appreciate what you're doing. Mike, as a human being, I'm so sad. My grandfather was World War I veteran, John Hugh Manson. He lied about his age, went into World War I, and that was in 1918. I wouldn't exist, Mike, without my grandfather coming back from World War I in Paris. He got gas with mustard gas. Mike, we've learned nothing, my friend. Nothing. We are in 2024 now. We have wars around the world. We have Gaza, Palestinians, Israel. We have Ukraine, Russia. My friend, have we not learned anything? War solves nothing, my friend. I'm so sad about all these innocent people around the world that are caught in war conflict, and I just pray.
What's your question for Mike, John?
Well, Mike, my question is, why are we still doing something, my friend, that it doesn't work? Whether you're a winner or a loser, Mike, it does not work. It doesn't work what you're doing.
So I do get what you're saying. There's
And
a
I'm going to
reason.
sign off. I'm going to sign off and let Mike answer, John, because you guys can't hear each other. But
Yeah,
thank you for
sounds
the
good.
call,
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Have a
Thank
great
you,
night.
Mike. Love you.
Go ahead, Mike.
I do appreciate what he's saying about his ancestor, his veteran ancestor. That's important. My ancestors, my name Pekarek is Czech. My great grandfather fled what was then Bohemia. It's the Czech Republic now. It was about an hour south of Prague. I visited his farmhouse about a couple of years ago. And he fled a Europe that had been racked by wars for a long time. The history of Europe got real bloody quite a bit. When I was looking at NATO, one of the things to understand about NATO is that it is a defensive treaty, it's a military treaty, but it is one of the most effective organizations for the creation of peace in modern human history. I mean, I can only go so far back, but Europe if you look at the 1800s through 1945, you had the Napoleonic Wars, various Habsburg revolutions. 1848, I think all of Europe was at war. That was an awful time to be in Europe. The 1853 to 1856 Crimean War. There were 3 separate Russian-Ottoman wars in the 1800s. One century, 3 separate wars between Russia and the Ottomans. There was the Spanish-American War that was global. World War I, World War II, which was just huge and just brutally destructive. And in 1945, we said, look, we need to do something that will stop this. We need to rebuild Europe. We had the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and Japan. We threw all sorts of resources and effort at it. We formed this treaty between former foes. It wasn't necessarily an important event it was important. I shouldn't downplay this. So every year in Normandy, they celebrate the Normandy invasions where we began the liberation of French from Nazi rule. And the French still thank us for it. Just in Americans showing up at Normandy. But the year that I went, it was the first time that the German military, the Bundeswehr, was participating in the D-Day commemorations. And when you're at the beaches or Punt du Hoc, or there was a church that I went out that was a Nazi war crime that nobody knows about, but people there know about it. There are German soldiers in formation at these commemorations. You've got German soldiers next to French soldiers next to you, British soldiers next to American soldiers. They're all together, they're all friends, they're all allies. And when you're thinking about the history of Europe and what NATO has done, and you've got Germans standing next to French, and if you know anything about that, that's just astonishing, that the success that NATO has had. I don't want to understate this, that NATO is just astonishing. 75 years through 2022, there were no big land wars in Europe, and that was unheard of historically. And then who kicks this? It wasn't the US, it wasn't the Ukrainians, it wasn't the Germans, it wasn't the French, it was the Russians. There is exactly one person, one group, one nation that's responsible for the current problem. And what I said, they could take their toys and go home, and this would be over right now. And that's the only nation that is capable of ending this war right now, is the Russians. So when I hear what you're talking about, but it's very much to say peace, peace, peace. I get it. But when we look at historically, should we make peace? Do we have to fight? Sometimes you have to fight. Some people you can negotiate with, and some people you can make peace with. And some people will eventually be your friends. But some people you have to stop. and there's just no other answer. And as awful that is, and the struggle and the pain and the sacrifice that you have to go through to get to the point where it's stopped, the people in France know how important it was that we fought. The people in Poland know how important it was that we fought. It's not even close to a thing that in maybe 1943, maybe we should have made peace. Really?
Well, maybe I can suggest a current scenario. The current Cuban Missile Crisis. We have Russian submarines sitting off the coast of Florida right now in Cuba, equipped with nuclear weapons, very likely. The mainstream media not talking about it. Nobody's really talking much about it. Trump mentioned it. But, if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the United States justified? Would they have been justified in invading or taking over Cuba? I think at the time some people said yes because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I don't know if the mindset is there right now. Would the United States be justified in invading Cuba right now because there are Russian submarines with nuclear weapons sitting in port in Cuba? I'm not sure that that's legally justified any more than Russia is justified in invading Ukraine because they're worried about NATO, Ukraine joining NATO. I don't know that legally it's not justified. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I
do. And so it's an interesting question. I might point out that when JFK faced this, did he invade? No. How was the original Cuban Missile Crisis solved? Through negotiations and diplomacy. We ended it up.
Well, there was the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yeah,
prior to that.
That's true.
That's a little bit different scenario. But
that's a little different.
He green-lighted it.
Yeah. So that one was a counter-revolutionary thing. I get it. I think it was not our best moment. But in terms of the actual Cuban Missile Crisis, or what's going on today, which is a pale shadow when you're talking about the amount of weapons involved.
Right.
And honestly, Russian submarines, they don't have a lot of them, certainly not compared to the Cold War. Yeah. That might be one of the few parts of the Russian military I'd be willing to say is possibly effective and incredibly dangerous. And I'm sure that the West has been tracking all of these submarines. And when I'd like to say, I can't remember the name of the class of the submarine, but it's one of their new ones that went into Cuba. Almost simultaneously, an American submarine surfaced in the naval base at Guantanamo, which is the one part of Cuba that America still owns. That I would bet a lot of money that was the submarine that was trailing the Russian sub. It had eyes on that Russian sub from the time that sub, the Russians left their port, to the time it surfaced at Cuba. I bet the Americans were tailing it the entire time because Russia has been making nuclear threats. And that's something to take seriously. And we've given them strong warnings. But when I said trust and verify on your news, well, trust and verify when you're talking about a nuclear threat. So I get it. The current situation is not great, but we knew that Cuba was still a friend of Russia. That's been true for decades and decades. The Russian ships visit Cuban ports is true. That this one was a nuclear capable one. They were saber rattling. Yes, that's true. But we also counter rattled where we surfaced the sub and said, yeah, we knew you were there. We knew where you were the entire time. So there was a counter there that didn't necessarily get the press that maybe it deserved, where the Americans were like, yeah, we got you.
Well, I do see the concern about NATO, but at the same time, Ukraine is a sovereign nation state. It has a right to exist. Ukraine did not invade Russia. Where are the troops right now? The Russian troops.
All of them inside Ukraine.
They're in Ukraine. Yeah. So I don't know. It seems pretty clear that this is an invasion
Yes.
of Ukraine. You can call it a special military operation if you want to, but looks a whole lot like a war to me.
Yes. And it's interesting that that they're not even allowed to call it a war. So
Yeah.
there's a whole song and dance that you can talk about with that too.
Yes. Any other questions here, guys, for Mike tonight? Oh, there was somebody here. I think we sort of you sort of addressed it, but I guess people want to know again or
Sure.
maybe elaborate. Yes, Rick, someone asked, where does he see things going if Trump is elected?
So that's something that I can't really talk about except in a personal, and since I have my official affiliation right underneath my name, I can't really talk about it as official. So it's similar to when I was an active duty military person and I was in public in my uniform. I was literally the voice of the United States Air Force because I was wearing an Air Force uniform at the time. So right now I can't really speak to my personal opinion of that. I do think that NATO has been working to, one of the things I didn't mention when I was talking about NATO is I talked about the percentage GDP of various nations, but when you're talking about the actual dollars on the ground in terms of NATO military expenditure, the United States has a $28 trillion economy. It's the biggest economy in the world. And the rest of NATO, all of the other 31 nations of NATO together added up, have $24.5 trillion in gross domestic product. Now, America has 330 million people, and the rest of NATO has 563 million people, so they have not too far away from twice the number of the American people and the rest of NATO. But by far, the big heavyweight in NATO is the Americans. And that's just on a numbers game. You can't get around it. Could the rest of NATO do more? Looking at you, Canada, yes, you could. And you should. President Trump spent 4 years very vocally and publicly saying the rest of NATO, you need to do more. And he was,
in fact, I think they're making the 2% mandatory
so
as of the last meeting, right?
They were trying, but like I said, sometimes this takes some effort. Canada will have a hard time going from 1.3 to 2%. That's a big jump. And so there's one thing to throw money at it, but you also have to have the ability to use the money effectively, wisely, and efficiently. So there's a limit to how fast you can throw more money at it. So you can do it, but you have to be careful. So it does take some time, and there was the big spur that in 2021, after 4 years of Donald Trump, there were only 6 NATO nations, including the United States, that were above 2%. And by 2023, a combination of President Biden's leadership and just the sheer grit and obvious choice that we needed to support Ukraine, and the fact that Russia was willing to invade a nation without provocation, all of a sudden, a lot of NATO nations say, we could be next. It spurred a lot of action. And under not just President Biden's leadership, but a lot of other NATO nation leaders, heads of state, it went from 6 after 4 years of Donald Trump to 23 as of January 1st of this year. And it's only going to go up from there. So, yes, NATO needs to do more. Donald Trump was not wrong. President Biden was asking the same thing. President Biden was not wrong. President Obama was asking the same thing. President Obama was not wrong. And the same for President Bush. The 90s were a little bit different. Everybody was doing the peace dividend. But yeah, so there are some things that President Trump could do well. There are certain avenues to convincing President Trump that Ukraine is a thing that he needs to support. There are certainly a large part of the Republican elected officials in Congress that vocally and actively support Ukraine. And when you look at the demographics of voters, Republican voters, they actively support Ukraine. So I think there's an avenue, despite some of the resistance and the statements. I think, like what President Zelensky said, that if that happens, then, well, elections have consequences, and that's where we're at, and that's what we work with. So I think President Trump could be convinced to do great things, but we'll see how that goes.
And we have another regular on the line here, a contributor to the program. We call him Dragon. It's Ian. Go ahead, Dragon. What's your question for Mike?
Well, my question for Mike would be, how is the situation with the Cuban crisis that we have now? How bad it is? How serious is the situation? And is NATO or Canada should have done more to that, to pressurize Russia not to be sitting around our borders?
So how serious is the situation with the Russian subs in Cuba, and or should Canada have done more? Should we be doing more on the Canadian side to put pressure on Russia? Is that the question?
That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll hang up and let Mike speak to that. Thanks, Dragon.
No problem.
So, caveat here, you're going to want to do more research, but my impression is that it's not anything that we haven't really seen for any number of moments of Russian ships visiting Cuba than we haven't seen for the past several years. There was a hiatus. There was at least more than a decade. I'd like to see even more than 2 decades where Russian ships were not visiting Cuba, and then they restarted. And that was some cause for worry, but the Russian Navy is significantly smaller than it was even 30 years ago. And the American Navy is not as big as it was either, but the Russian Navy just got gutted. So they are finally building more decent subs, but their current version of an attack sub is a 1980s design. The first copy of that class, I think, took like 30 years to build. They started it in 1988. I don't think it finished until the last couple of years. So it was just sitting there for a long time. It could possibly be an effective submarine, but that remains to be seen. So I don't think it's any more serious. I think Russia wanted to make it serious. I think maybe during America's silly season, maybe some people were blowing it up more than it should be. It's just like, oh, there's a Russian sub in Cuba. Why didn't somebody do something about it? Well, we don't exactly give orders to Russian subs, and Russian Navy vessels visiting Cuba is not unheard of. So it's one of those things. And like I said about the American submarine that surfaced almost immediately afterwards, that was kind of one of those, we got you. Yeah, we've been watching you. We're here. Yeah, that I don't think it's as serious as people are making it out to be. It's always concerning, but like I said, Cuba's been a Russian ally for a long time. I think it's in America's best interest to fix that. And I think for a while we were moving in that direction. I'd like to see us move in that direction more strongly now. I think the Cubans are ready to be friends with America again, maybe under better circumstances than in the 1950s. Again, maybe not our finest hour. But I think the smart move would be to flip Cuba. That would be the smart move. Make that into a friend of the West. Now, in terms of what Canada could do, I think they're already doing some. I know Canada has some internal politics I don't necessarily understand, but they are making some big moves. Seems like forever ago I mentioned the Americans in 1934 saving their shipyards and building the ships that won the Battle of Midway. We're doing that again, but Canada is starting to bulk up their Navy. They're starting to recapitalize their Air Force with new jets. They're doing a lot of basic groundwork that I really wish they had done 10 years ago in 2014 when Russia invaded the first time. but at least they're maybe starting to do it now. The jets, the jets Canada is currently flying are Legacy Hornets. Upgraded, they're possibly great jets, but they're old and there's only so much technology that you can throw at metal fatigue. So when you're flying if you have a Ferrari in your garage and you drive it hard every time you take it out of the garage, 40 years later, it's not going to be the same Ferrari that it was when you bought it. So the same is going to be true of those Legacy Hornets, the F-18Cs that Canada flies. They were great jets, and with upgrades, they're possibly still great jets, but they're old, and there's nothing that can fix that other than buying new jets. So Canada's trying to do that. I believe they've got a frigate program. I'm trying to remember if I was reading about submarines or not, or if I'm mixing that up with another NATO nation. But there's a lot of basic work that Canada is doing, and they should be doing, and they should have done 10 years ago.
I think we bought some used subs. I think that's actually what we did.
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
I think
did they leak?
I think so.
Okay.
To go with our canoes, but
used isn't necessarily bad, but used can be bad.
That was a few years ago. I might be a little out of date on that information.
Yeah, I'll look that up again. I don't remember what the story was, but I do know that there is a surface ship program, a major one that sometimes Canada doesn't get the credit it deserves for the contributions to the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, where Canada had a very real and significant naval presence, fighting the U-boats especially, but doing other things as well. They had significant army presence in the liberation of France, among other things. So Canadians do have a proud military history. I think they should be doing more now.
What is the impact on us here domestically in Canada, in the United States, if Ukraine falls, or if we get a new president who comes in and says, let's just pull out and not support Ukraine. This isn't worth it. Let's just give it up.
So I'm going to go back to what other people have called this moment in time is our 1938 moment. This is the time where we either capitulate in the face of aggression or we stop it. We choose to stop it. And that's the choice in front of us. We need to make the right choice. And the effect on the rest of the world, if we allow Russia to have its way in Ukraine, in the face of all the war crimes that I detailed earlier, and just the fact that we let them invade and conquer a country, and we allowed it to happen on our watch, is not something that history will certainly not treat it kindly, but the citizens of the West should not treat kindly. And that's part of the thing where I mentioned that there is bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States, and the elected officials need to understand that. There's side benefits, like I said. I don't want to be making it sound like we're profiting off of somebody else's pain, but when people are resistant to helping, and they're like, well, the dollars are going nowhere. Well, they're going somewhere, and a lot of those dollars are going to Americans, and not just rich people. It's all those people that are working in the factories making great money at high-skilled jobs. There's any number of factories near me. There's the ammunition plant that's about an hour south of me, that's run by General Dynamics, a part of Lockheed. Boeing has a bad name in the airline industry now, but their military branch is superb. They've got F-15s, Super Hornets, and the new MQ-25, I'd like to say, Stingray drone for the Navy, all within close distance of where I am right now. And all of those things bring in good money. They're high-paying jobs. They're people really have to know what they're doing to do those jobs. So the skill level that can demand the high pay. We We in America can't allow Ukraine to fall for moral reasons. We must support them, because to fail to support them would be to allow historic aggression and war crimes to stand unmatched, unopposed. And when you do not match them, when you do not oppose them, there was a saying in the Air Force, what you walk past is what you condone. And if I, in the Air Force, would watch somebody doing a bad job and just walk past it and not saying anything, I effectively said, that's okay. Yeah, you can do a bad job. Just shoddy work. That's great. If I saw somebody committing a crime and I just walked past, that crime's fine. I'm okay. I'm good with that crime. So the failure to support Ukraine, the failure to oppose Russia, would be saying that's fine. Bucha, Izium, 700,000 children kidnapped, that's fine. No, that's great. Let's just make peace. That's not okay. That is not, when I say this is the clearest moral choice of our time, I'm not joking. The stakes are real, they're huge, and history's watching. 10 years from now, what would they say? 20 years from now. We need to be careful, yes, but we need to act. There's some things you negotiate with, and there's some things you stop. Now is the time where there's something that you stop. There are people on the fence, and like I said, there's the arguments for that too.
Mike, I appreciate you joining us here tonight. I want to have you back real soon, because there's a whole other list of topics that I'd like to have you comment on, but we're out of time tonight.
Okay.
I'll just throw it to you for a final comment. Anything that you think we might have missed, or just a final wrap up?
I wish I had said my last statement and cut it short, that we're at our historic moment where we need to respond and we need to stop, and that's the only clear choice. Anything else is condoning heinous war crimes on a staggering level, and there is no other choice. I don't know how to put it more clearly. I want to reemphasize, people need to do better research. Don't take my claims at face value. Look them up. I can send you links for the places I found some of this information. I'm happy to do that. And inform yourself and become educated citizens, but not only from one source, not only from one perspective. You need to hear the people you disagree with to understand where you're wrong, because nobody will tell you where you're wrong faster than somebody that disagrees with you. Or you need to understand why you disagree with somebody. If you don't listen to the people that you disagree with and actually try and wrap your head around what they're saying, you have no idea why you disagree with them. And so your disagreement is kind of pointless and mindless at that point. And why are you even thinking, why do you even have that opinion if you didn't do that? So that's one of the main reasons I listen to people that I disagree with. All I can say is become an educated citizen and understand the magnitude of the problem and the magnitude of the crimes and the magnitude of the historic moment, and really gut check yourself on what is necessary now.
Okay. Mike Pekarek, thank you very much. I'm going to sign off. Stick around for just a moment, Mike. After we sign off, I just want to talk to you about one thing before we part ways. And folks, you know what's going on out in the world. People are wondering if Joe Biden is even still alive tonight. So, but we're not going to go down those rabbit holes this evening. I think we've had ample opportunity to explore a wide range of things this evening. So we're gonna wrap it up. I'll be back tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Love you guys. Thank you all for hanging out here tonight, and hopefully I see you all back here tomorrow night on the flip side.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.